The bruise on my shoulder was fresh, purple, and angry, shaped like Derek's thumbprint. He'd cornered me in the kitchen that morning, fingers digging into my collarbone while he whispered threats about what would happen if I ever told anyone about the family business. His breath smelled like stale coffee and rage. But as I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror touching the tender skin, I did something I'd never done before. I smiled, because 3 hours earlier I'd gotten a call that would change everything. The court date was set. Derek Wilson had no idea that in exactly 2 weeks he'd be sitting in handcuffs while a judge read his sentence. I leaned close to the mirror and whispered the words that had been burning in my chest for months. "Karma's coming, Derek, and she's bringing backup." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Maya Thompson, and this story isn't just about surviving abuse. It's about the moment when the universe finally catches up with the people who think they're untouchable. Derek had been my stepfather for 4 years, and for 3 of those years, he'd made my life a calculated nightmare. But what he didn't know was that I'd been documenting everything. Every bruise, every threat, every time he made my mother choose between protecting me and keeping the peace. He thought silence was his weapon, but I turned it into mine. The abuse started small, the way it always does. A grip that lasted too long during family photos. Comments about my body that made my skin crawl. Punishment that went beyond normal parenting into something darker, more personal. Derek was smart about it. He never left marks where people could see them easily. Never screamed loud enough for neighbors to hear. He was a master of psychological warfare, and my mother, Lisa, became his unwitting accomplice through willful blindness. I was 15 when Derek married my mom. She'd been a single parent for 7 years after my dad died in a car accident, and she was so desperate for stability, for someone to help carry the financial burden, that she missed all the red flags. Or maybe she saw them and chose to ignore them because the alternative felt scarier than staying alone. Derek worked in construction management, made decent money, and knew exactly what to say to a grieving widow who wanted to believe in second chances. The first incident happened 6 months after the wedding. I'd forgotten to take out the trash, something my mom usually handled with a gentle reminder and maybe extra chores for the weekend. But Derek decided this was a teaching moment. He grabbed my arm and twisted it behind my back, marching me to the garage where he shoved my face toward the garbage can. "This is what happens when you disrespect this house," he said, his voice calm and controlled. "Your mother works hard to keep things nice, and you're going to learn to appreciate that." The pressure on my arm increased until I thought something might snap. When he finally let go, I had finger-shaped bruises that lasted for days. I told my mom that night, showing her the marks on my arm. She stared at them for a long time, and I saw something flicker in her eyes. Recognition maybe, or fear. But then Derek walked into the kitchen, and her expression shifted. "Maya's always been dramatic about discipline," she said, not meeting my eyes. "She's not used to having a father figure who sets boundaries." Derek smiled and kissed the top of her head, playing the part of the patient stepfather, dealing with a difficult teenager. That was the moment I realized I was on my own. The next 3 years were a masterclass in systematic psychological destruction. Derek was careful, methodical. He'd wait until my mom was at her book club meetings or running errands. He'd create situations where I was isolated with him, then use those moments to establish his power. Sometimes it was physical, a shove here, a painful grip there, always in places clothes would cover, but mostly it was mental. He'd tell me how worthless I was, how my father would be ashamed of the person I was becoming, how my mother's life would be so much easier without me around. He had this game he liked to play, where he'd take something of mine, something important, and hide it or destroy it. My dad's watch that I wore every day, photos from before he came into our lives, college brochures I'd requested. Then he'd act concerned when I couldn't find these things, offering to help look while my mom worried about my carelessness and lack of responsibility. I started keeping everything important in a lockbox hidden in my closet, but even that felt like giving him power over what I was allowed to have. The worst part wasn't the abuse itself, it was watching my mother transform into someone I didn't recognize. Lisa had always been strong, independent, the kind of woman who fixed her own car and taught me to change a tire when I was 12. But Derek systematically dismantled her confidence, convinced her that she needed him for everything. When I tried to talk to her about his behavior, she'd get defensive, accusing me of trying to sabotage her happiness. "Derek's been nothing but patient with you," she'd say. "Maybe if you tried harder to be part of this family instead of fighting it, things would be different." By my senior year of high school, I'd developed what my guidance counselor called behavioral problems. I was skipping classes, my grades had dropped, and I'd started having panic attacks during tests. Everyone assumed it was typical teenage rebellion, combined with stress about college applications. Nobody looked deeper. Because Derek and my mom presented such a picture-perfect front to the outside world, they attended school events together, volunteered for community fundraisers, and Derek even coached Tyler's Little League team. To everyone in Riverside, they were the ideal blended family, but I was learning things about survival that they don't teach in health class. I learned to read Derek's moods in the way he closed cabinets, or the tone he used when asking about my day. I learned to become invisible when his work stress reached certain levels, and I learned
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
to redirect his attention when Tyler accidentally did something that might trigger an outburst. Most importantly, I learned to document everything. It started with a small notebook I kept in my backpack. Date, time, what happened, any witnesses who might have seen aftermath. When Derek grabbed my wrist hard enough to leave marks because I'd been disrespectful during dinner, I wrote it down. When he cornered me in the laundry room and told me that colleges were probably too expensive anyway, and maybe I should consider staying home to help my mom, I wrote it down. When he went through my bedroom while I was at work and rearranged everything just to show he could, I wrote it down. Eventually, I upgraded to taking photos. The bruises were easy to document, but I also started photographing broken items, text messages from my mom asking me to try harder with Derek, and even recording some of his verbal tirades when I could do it safely. I created email accounts he didn't know about, backing everything up to cloud storage with passwords he could never guess. I was building a case without even knowing that's what I was doing. The turning point came during Christmas break of my senior year. Tyler, who was only 8, had knocked over Derek's beer while running through the living room. It was an accident, the kind of thing kids do, but Derek's reaction was volcanic. He grabbed Tyler by the shoulders and started shaking him, screaming about respect and consequences. Tyler was crying, my mom was frozen, and something inside me just snapped. "Get away from him," I said, standing up from the couch. My voice was steady, but my hands were shaking. Derek turned to look at me, still holding Tyler, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Not just anger, but genuine surprise that I'd challenged him directly. "Excuse me," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "He's 8 years old," I said. "It was an accident. Let go of him." Derek released Tyler, who ran to our mom, but his attention was now fully focused on me. "You want to play parent, Maya? You think you know how to handle discipline better than I do?" I should have backed down. Every survival instinct I'd developed over 3 years was screaming at me to apologize, to deflect, to become small and invisible until his anger passed. Instead, I looked him straight in the eye and said, "I think you're a bully who picks on children because you're too weak to handle actual problems." The room went completely silent. My mom gasped, Tyler stopped crying. Derek's face went through several different expressions before settling on something cold and calculating. He walked toward me slowly, and I knew I'd crossed a line there was no coming back from. "What did you just say to me?" he asked. "You heard me," I said, though my voice was starting to shake now, "and someday, someone's going to hold you accountable for what you do in this house." Derek smiled then, but it wasn't a nice smile. "Is that right? You think someone's coming to save you, Maya? You think anyone would believe your word against mine?" He leaned closer. "I've been patient with you because I love your mother, but my patience has limits. And you just found them." That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Derek came to my room. He didn't knock, just opened the door and stood in the doorway, backlit by the hallway light. I was lying in bed, pretending to sleep, but my heart was racing so fast I was sure he could hear it. "You made a mistake tonight," he said quietly. "Disrespecting me in front of Tyler, in front of your mother. That's not how this family works." He stepped into the room, and I could smell his cologne, the same scent that had started making me nauseous months ago. "But I'm going to give you a chance to make it right. Tomorrow, you're going to apologize. You're going to tell your mother that you've been acting out because of stress, and you're going to promise to do better." I didn't say anything, just kept my eyes closed and tried to breathe normally. "And if you don't," Derek continued, "if you keep trying to cause problems in this house, I'm going to make sure your senior year becomes very difficult. College applications can get lost. Recommendation letters can get delayed. Financial aid paperwork can be filed incorrectly. Your mother trusts me to handle a lot of the household administrative work, Maya. It would be a shame if some important documents went missing." He stood there for another moment, letting his threat sink in, then left without closing the door. I lay awake for hours that night, staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out what to do. Because I finally understood something that had taken me 3 years to see clearly. Derek wasn't just abusing me, he was systematically destroying any possibility I had of escaping him. And my mother was letting him do it. The next morning, I didn't apologize. Instead, I did something that would change the trajectory of everything. I walked into the Riverside Public Library, where I worked part-time shelving books, and I asked Mrs. Patterson, the head librarian, if I could use one of the private computer stations. I told her I needed to research something for a school project, which wasn't entirely a lie. For 2 hours, I researched domestic violence laws in Ohio. I learned about mandatory reporting requirements, about evidence standards, about resources for victims of family abuse. Most importantly, I learned about emancipation procedures for minors who were being abused by guardians. It turned out that at 17, with sufficient evidence of abuse and a viable plan for self-support, I could potentially petition the court to legally separate myself from my mother and Derek. But I needed more than just my notebook and some photos. I needed witnesses, official documentation, or recording of the abuse happening, and I needed professional help from someone who knew how to navigate the legal system. That's when I remembered something my health teacher had mentioned during our unit on domestic violence. Medical professionals were mandatory reporters. If a doctor had reason to believe a minor was being abused, they were legally required to report it to Child Protective Services. I'd been putting off getting my shoulder looked at. The injury from Derek's grip 3 days earlier was getting worse instead of better, and I was having trouble lifting my arm above my head. I'd been hoping it would heal on its own, but now I realized this might be the opportunity I'd been waiting for, evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. That afternoon, I told my mom I needed to go to urgent care because my shoulder was bothering me. She was distracted, focused on some problem Tyler was having with his math homework, and she just handed me her insurance card and told me to call Derek to drive me. The irony wasn't lost on me. "I can take the bus," I said. "It's not that serious." "Don't be ridiculous," she replied. "Derek won't mind. He's always willing to help when someone needs medical attention." I almost laughed at that. Derek would probably love the chance to control the narrative if I was seeing a doctor. He could play the concerned stepfather, make sure I didn't say anything that might raise questions. But I had a different plan. I called Derek and asked him to drop me off at the urgent care clinic, but told him he didn't need to wait. "I'll probably be here for a while," I said. "I can call Mom to pick me up when I'm done." Derek seemed pleased that I was being reasonable and independent, not realizing that I was setting up exactly the situation I needed. Dr. Amanda Mitchell was younger than I expected, probably in her early 30s, with kind eyes and the sort of gentle confidence that made you want to trust her immediately. When she asked about my shoulder injury, I took a deep breath and told her the truth. Not just about the physical pain, but about how it happened, about Derek's grip, about the pattern of injuries over the past 3 years, about my fear of what would happen when I turned 18 and lost what little legal protection I had as a minor. Dr. Mitchell listened without interrupting, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates or previous injuries. When I finished talking, she was quiet for a long moment, then she said, "Maya, I need you to know that what you're describing isn't normal family discipline, this is abuse, and it's not your fault." Hearing a medical professional say those words out loud was like having someone validate reality after years of being told I was dramatic, oversensitive, or lying. Dr. Mitchell examined my shoulder carefully, documenting the injury pattern and taking photographs with my permission. She also asked about other injuries, and I showed her faded marks on my arms and ribs from previous incidents. "I'm going to be honest with you, Dr. Mitchell said, as she finished her examination. "I'm a mandatory reporter, which means I'm legally required to contact Child Protective Services about this situation, but I also want you to know that you have options, and there are people who can help you navigate this process safely." My heart started racing. I'd known this was a possibility, but I suddenly felt terrified about what would happen when Derek and my mom found out that I'd reported the abuse. Dr. Mitchell must have seen the panic in my eyes because she sat down next to me and spoke gently. "Maya, I understand you're scared, most people in your situation are, but staying silent isn't keeping you safe, it's just allowing the abuse to continue and potentially escalate. You took a very brave step by coming here today and telling me the truth." She handed me a card with contact information for Janet Brooks, a social worker who specialized in cases involving teen abuse. "I'm going to call Child Protective Services today, but I'm also going to make sure Janet is assigned to your case. She's excellent at helping young people in situations like yours." Dr. Mitchell also gave me information about Haven House, a women's shelter in Riverside that had programs specifically for teenagers who were being abused by family members. "If you ever feel like you're in immediate danger," she said, "you can go there directly, they have emergency beds available 24 hours a day." As I left the clinic that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not just hope that the abuse would stop, but hope that I might actually have a future beyond Derek's control. For the first time, I had adults who believed me, who understood the situation, and who had the knowledge and authority to actually do something about it. When Derek picked me up, I was calm. He asked about the appointment, and I told him the doctor said I'd strained a muscle and prescribed rest and anti-inflammatory medication. "Nothing serious," I said. "Should be better in a week or two." Derek seemed satisfied with this explanation, probably relieved that there wouldn't be any ongoing medical issues that might require more doctor visits or scrutiny. That night at dinner, I looked across the table at Derek cutting his steak and making small talk with my mom about his work project, and I felt something I'd never felt before when looking at him. Pity. He had no idea that his entire world was about to change. He thought he was untouchable, that his careful manipulation and intimidation had created a perfect system where he could abuse me with impunity. But I'd found the crack in his armor, and I'd done something he never expected me to be smart enough or brave enough to do. I'd told the truth to someone who was legally obligated to act on it. As Derek laughed at something Tyler said, completely relaxed and confident in his power, I took a sip of water and smiled to myself, because I knew something he didn't know yet. Karma wasn't just coming. She'd already been set in motion, and she was bringing the full weight of the legal system with her. The call came 2 days later while I was at school. Janet Brooks introduced herself as a Child Protective Services investigator and asked if I could meet with her that afternoon. Her voice was professional but warm, the kind of tone that suggested she'd had this conversation with scared teenagers before. I agreed to meet her at the library after my shift, somewhere public but private enough to talk freely. Janet was a woman in her 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, and eyes that seemed to see everything without judging any of it. She wore simple clothes, and carried a worn leather briefcase that looked like it had seen years of difficult cases. When she shook my hand, her grip was firm and steady, and I felt immediately that this was someone who took her job seriously. We found a quiet corner in the library's reference section, surrounded by dusty volumes of encyclopedias that nobody used anymore since the internet became ubiquitous. Janet pulled out a small digital recorder and asked permission to tape our conversation. "This helps me remember details accurately when I write my report," she explained. "And it protects both of us by creating an official record of what we discuss." For the next 2 hours, Janet walked me through everything I'd experienced with Derek. She was thorough, but patient, asking specific questions about dates, witnesses, and documentation without making me feel like I was being interrogated. When I showed her my notebook with its careful records of incidents, her eyebrows raised slightly. "You've been keeping detailed records for how long?" she asked, flipping through pages of my handwriting. "About 2 years consistently," I said. "I started with just writing things down, so I wouldn't forget them, or start doubting myself. Derek has this way of making you question your own memory of events." Janet nodded knowingly. "That's called gaslighting, and it's a common tactic used by abusers. The fact that you recognized it and took steps to document reality shows remarkable insight for someone your age." She was particularly interested in the photos I'd taken of injuries and the recordings I'd made of Derek's verbal abuse. "Maya, this level of documentation is going to be crucial for building a strong case. Most teens in your situation don't have this kind of evidence, which makes it much harder to prove the abuse occurred." When I told her about Derek's threats regarding my college applications and financial aid, Janet's expression grew serious. "Educational sabotage is a form of abuse we see in cases where the perpetrator wants to maintain long-term control over their victim. By threatening your future independence, he's trying to ensure you remain dependent on him and your mother." Janet explained the investigation process to me. She would need to interview my mother and Derek separately, as well as Tyler if she felt it was appropriate. She'd also be speaking with my teachers, my supervisor at the library, and possibly some of our neighbors. "I know this feels invasive," she said, "but we need to build a complete picture of your family dynamics and look for patterns that support your allegations." She also warned me that things might get worse at home before they got better. Abusers often escalate their behavior when they feel their control being threatened. Derek is going to figure out pretty quickly that someone has reported him, and he may become more aggressive as a result. That thought terrified me, but Janet had a plan for that too. She gave me a safety plan that included keeping my phone charged at all times, identifying safe spaces in the house, and quick exit routes, and memorizing the phone number for Haven House's emergency hotline. "If you feel like you're in immediate danger, don't hesitate to call 911 or go directly to the shelter," she said. "Your safety is more important than maintaining the investigation." The next few days were surreal. I went to school, worked my shifts at the library, and ate dinner with Derek and my mom as if nothing had changed. But underneath the surface of normal routine, I could feel the tension building. Derek seemed more watchful than usual, paying closer attention to my conversations and asking more questions about how I spent my time. He started checking my phone more frequently, going through my text messages and browser history with a thoroughness that felt increasingly paranoid. My mom, meanwhile, seemed oblivious to the undercurrent of suspicion. She was focused on planning Tyler's 9th birthday party and dealing with some drama at her book club about their next selection. When Derek made comments about my attitude or suggested I was being secretive lately, she brushed him off with the kind of casual dismissal that had become her default response to any tension between us. The first interview happened on a Thursday afternoon. I was at school when Janet arrived at our house to speak with my mother. Derek had taken the day off work, claiming he had a dentist appointment, but I suspected he wanted to be there to monitor what my mom said. When I got home that evening, the atmosphere in the house was electric with barely contained tension. My mom was in the kitchen, aggressively chopping vegetables for dinner with more force than was strictly necessary. Her movements were sharp and angry, and she didn't look up when I walked in. Derek sat at the kitchen table, ostensibly reading the newspaper, but I could tell he was listening to every sound my mom made. "How was school?" Derek asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Fine," I replied, opening the refrigerator to get a bottle of water. "Normal Thursday." "That's good," he said. "Sometimes routine gets disrupted by unexpected visitors, people asking questions about things they don't understand." My mom slammed the knife down on the cutting board with enough force to make both Derek and me jump. "I don't want to talk about it," she said, without turning around. "That woman had no right to come into our home and imply that we're bad parents, so Janet had already been here." I tried to keep my expression neutral, but my heart was racing. This was it. The investigation was officially underway, and there was no going back now. "What woman?" I asked, trying to sound confused rather than terrified. Derek folded his newspaper with deliberate precision. "A social worker came by today, asking questions about our family. Apparently, someone has been spreading lies about how we handle discipline in this house." The way he said someone left no doubt about who he suspected. I could feel his eyes boring into me, searching for any sign of guilt or fear. I forced myself to meet his gaze with what I hoped looked like genuine bewilderment. "What kind of questions?" I asked. "Questions about whether anyone in this house has ever been hurt," my mom said, finally turning around. Her eyes were red, and I couldn't tell if she'd been crying from anger or sadness. "Questions about bruises and arguments, and whether Derek has ever laid a hand on you inappropriately." The word inappropriately hung in the air like an accusation. My mom was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between hurt and betrayal, and desperate hope that I would deny everything. "I told her this is a normal family with normal family problems," my mom continued. "I told her that teenagers sometimes exaggerate when they're angry about discipline. I told her that Derek has been nothing but patient and loving with both you and Tyler." Derek nodded approvingly. "Your mother handled the situation very well, but the social worker said she'd be back to talk to other people. Teachers, neighbors, maybe even you kids." He was watching my reaction carefully, and I knew this was a test. If I showed too much fear, or tried to deflect, he'd know for certain that I was the one who had reported him. If I acted too relieved or confident, that would also raise suspicions. I needed to thread the needle perfectly. "That sounds scary," I said, which was completely true. "What happens if they think something bad is going on?" "Nothing," Derek said firmly, "because nothing bad is going on. This is just bureaucratic harassment based on false information from someone who doesn't understand our family dynamic." Over the next week, the investigation intensified. Janet interviewed my English teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez,
who apparently mentioned that my grades had dropped significantly over the past 2 years, and that I often seemed tired and distracted in class. She spoke with my supervisor at the library, Mrs. Patterson, who told her I was a reliable employee but sometimes came to work with unexplained injuries. The most damaging interview, from Derek's perspective, was probably with our next-door neighbor, Mrs. Chen. She lived in the house closest to ours, and had apparently heard more than I realized over the years. Janet told me later that Mrs. Chen had described hearing shouting matches, the sound of things being thrown, and my voice crying or pleading on multiple occasions. She said she'd always wondered if everything was okay, Janet explained during one of our follow-up meetings, but she didn't want to interfere in family business. It's a common response, unfortunately. People hear concerning things but convince themselves it's not their place to get involved. Derek's interview with Janet was scheduled for the following Monday. He took another day off work, and I could tell he was preparing for it like a military operation. He spent the weekend cleaning the house obsessively, making sure everything looked perfect and normal. He coached Tyler on what to say if anyone asked him questions about our family, emphasizing how happy we all
were, and how well Derek took care of us. Remember, Derek told Tyler while they worked together organizing the garage, some people don't understand that families have rules and consequences. If anyone asks you about getting in trouble or being punished, you tell them that Derek is fair and that he never hurts anyone. I watched this conversation from the kitchen window, feeling sick to my stomach. Derek was systematically preparing to manipulate everyone involved in the investigation, including an 8-year-old boy who trusted him completely. The night before Derek's interview, he came to my room again. This time, he didn't bother with the pretense of standing in the doorway. He walked in and sat on the edge of my bed, close enough that I could smell his aftershave and see the calculating look in his eyes. "Tomorrow, I'm going to talk to that social worker," he said quietly, "and I'm going to tell her the truth about our family. About how patient I've been with you despite your behavioral problems. About how your mother and I have tried everything to help you adjust to having a father figure in your life." I didn't say anything, just kept my eyes fixed on my hands folded in my lap. "I'm also going to tell her about your history of lying and exaggerating when you don't get your way. About the time you claimed I broke your phone when you actually dropped it yourself. About how you told your mother I was going through your room when I was actually just bringing you clean laundry." These were all incidents Derek had twisted in his favor over the years, times when I'd accused him of things he then made me doubt. He was building a narrative where I was an unstable teenager who made false accusations against the man trying to help raise me. "But here's what I'm really going to tell her," Derek continued, leaning closer. "I'm going to tell her that I love you like my own daughter, despite how difficult you've been. I'm going to tell her that this family means everything to me, and I would never do anything to hurt it." The way he said love made my skin crawl. There was possession in it, ownership, but nothing that resembled actual affection or care. "And after I talk to her, this investigation is going to go away. Because there's no evidence of any wrongdoing, just the accusations of a troubled teenager who's been acting out since her biological father died." Bringing up my dad was a low blow, and Derek knew it. He'd used my grief as a weapon before, suggesting that my problems stemmed from unresolved daddy issues rather than his abuse. It was a particularly cruel form of gaslighting that made me question whether my pain was even legitimate. "So I want you to think very carefully about your next moves, Maya, because if this investigation concludes that you've been making false accusations against me, there are going to be consequences. Not just for you, but for your mother and Tyler too. Child Protective Services doesn't just disappear when they decide a family is dysfunctional. They keep watching, keep interfering, keep making life difficult for everyone involved." He stood up and looked down at me with an expression that was part sympathy and part threat. "I'd hate to see this family destroyed because one person couldn't learn to tell the truth." After he left, I lay awake for hours thinking about everything he'd said. Derek was right about one thing. If the investigation didn't find sufficient evidence of abuse, my life would become infinitely worse. He'd have confirmation that he could get away with anything, and he'd also have justification for escalating his control and punishment. The thought of living under his thumb for another year until I turned 18 felt impossible. But I also thought about Dr. Mitchell's words about mandatory reporting and Janet's explanation of how these investigations worked. They weren't looking for proof beyond a reasonable doubt like in a criminal trial. They were looking for evidence that abuse was likely occurring, and that intervention was necessary to protect a child's welfare. The standard was different, and I had more documentation than most victims could provide. Derek's interview took place on Monday afternoon. I was at school, but I spent the entire day distracted and anxious, wondering what he was telling Janet and whether his charm and manipulation would be enough to derail the investigation. When I got home, Derek was in an excellent mood, almost euphoric. He greeted me with a smile and asked about my day with what seemed like genuine interest. "How did your meeting go?" my mom asked him while she started dinner preparations. "Very well," Derek replied. "I think I was able to clear up a lot of misunderstandings about our family dynamic." The social worker seemed satisfied that we're dealing with typical teenage adjustment issues rather than anything more serious. He looked directly at me as he said this, and I saw triumph in his expression. Derek thought he'd won. He thought his performance had been convincing enough to end the investigation and prove that I was lying about everything. But what Derek didn't know was that Janet Brooks had been doing this job for over 15 years. She'd seen every type of abuser, every manipulation tactic, every carefully constructed false narrative designed to discredit victims. And she'd told me during one of our meetings that the most dangerous abusers were often the most charming during interviews. They present as concerned parents who are dealing with difficult children, she'd explained. They have answers for everything, explanations that sound reasonable on the surface. But there are patterns you learn to recognize, inconsistencies that emerge when you dig deeper. 3 days after Derek's interview, Janet called me with an update. Her voice was professional but contained an undercurrent of satisfaction that made my pulse quicken. "Maya, I wanted to let you know that we'll be moving forward with formal charges against your stepfather. Based on the evidence you provided, the witness statements we've collected, and our assessment of the family situation, we have reasonable cause to believe that abuse has occurred." I was sitting in my car in the library parking lot when she called, having just finished my evening shift. The relief that washed over me was so intense it was almost physical. For a moment, I couldn't speak. "What does that mean exactly?" I finally managed to ask. "It means Derek will be arrested and charged with child abuse and endangerment. The prosecutor's office will handle the criminal case from here. It also means we'll be implementing safety measures to protect you and Tyler while the legal process unfolds." Janet explained that Derek would likely be arrested within the next few days, as soon as the prosecutor's office finished preparing the formal charges. In the meantime, I should continue following the safety plan we'd established and avoid being alone with Derek whenever possible. "There's something else," Janet said. During my interview with Derek, he made several statements that were inconsistent with the evidence we have. He also demonstrated some concerning attitudes about power and control within families that raised additional red flags. I later learned that Derek had essentially incriminated himself during the interview. He'd tried so hard to present himself as the patient, long-suffering stepfather that he'd revealed his need to control and dominate rather than simply parent. When Janet asked about specific incidents I'd reported, Derek's explanations had been too detailed and rehearsed, suggesting he remembered these events very differently than someone who'd simply been trying to maintain household discipline. Most damaging was his response when Janet asked about my college plans. Derek had said something about hoping I would mature enough to realize that not everyone was cut out for higher education, and that sometimes staying close to family was more important than pursuing unrealistic goals. The way he described my academic potential and future prospects had been subtly demeaning in a way that revealed his investment in keeping me dependent and controlled. That night, I went to bed knowing that everything was about to change. Derek still didn't know about the formal charges being filed. He still believed his performance had been successful and that life would return to his version of normal.
But tomorrow or the next day, police officers would knock on our door with an arrest warrant, and Derek Wilson would finally face consequences for what he'd done to me. As I lay in the dark listening to the familiar sounds of our house settling, I thought about the moment Derek would realize that his careful manipulation and intimidation had failed. The moment he would understand that I hadn't been the helpless victim he'd thought I was, but someone who'd been building a case against him for years. I smiled to myself in the darkness and whispered the words I'd been saving for this moment. Karma's coming, Derek. And tomorrow she's bringing handcuffs. The knock came at 7:38 on a Wednesday morning. I know the exact time because I was staring at my alarm clock trying to force myself out of bed for another day of pretending everything was normal. The sound was authoritative and persistent, the kind of knocking that meant official business rather than a neighbor asking to borrow sugar. I heard Derek's heavy footsteps moving down the hallway, followed by the creak of the front door opening. Then silence. Complete, absolute silence that seemed to stretch for hours but probably lasted only seconds. When Derek finally spoke, his voice carried a tone I'd never heard before, carefully controlled but with an underlying tremor that suggested his world was shifting beneath his feet. "Officers, I think there's been some kind of mistake." My heart started pounding so hard I was sure everyone in the house could hear it. I slipped out of bed and crept to my bedroom door, pressing my ear against the wood to catch every word of the conversation happening in our front hallway. "Derek Wilson," the voice was official, matter of fact. "Yes, that's me, but I don't understand why you're here. Sir, we have a warrant for your arrest on charges of child abuse and endangerment. I need you to turn around and place your hands behind your back." The silence that followed was deafening. I imagined Derek's face going through a series of expressions as he processed what was happening, as the reality of consequences finally penetrated his carefully constructed sense of invincibility. "This is ridiculous," Derek said, and now I could hear the anger creeping into his voice. "I want to see that warrant. I want to call my lawyer. This is harassment based on false accusations from a disturbed teenager. Sir, you'll have the opportunity to make phone calls from the station. Right now I need you to comply with the arrest." I heard my mother's voice then, high and confused, coming from the direction of the kitchen. "Derek, what's happening? Who are these people?" "Ma'am, we're with the Riverside Police Department. We're executing an arrest warrant for Mr. Wilson. Is there somewhere you and any children in the house can wait while we complete this process?" The next few minutes were a blur of voices and movement. Tyler started crying, not understanding why strangers were in our house or why Derek was being led outside in handcuffs. My mother's voice grew increasingly hysterical as she demanded explanations that no one was giving her. Through my bedroom window, I watched Derek being placed in the back of a police cruiser, his face a mask of rage and disbelief. After the police cars pulled away, our house fell into a shocked silence. I stayed in my room, not ready to face my mother's questions or Tyler's confusion. I could hear my mom making phone calls, her voice alternating between frantic whispers and barely controlled shouting. She called Derek's brother, his work supervisor, anyone she thought might have answers or influence. Around 10 o'clock, there was a soft knock on my bedroom door. "Maya?" My mother's voice was strained, exhausted. "We need to talk." I opened the door to find my mom standing in the hallway, still wearing her pajamas, her hair uncombed and her eyes red from crying. She looked older than I'd ever seen her, as if the events of the morning had aged her several years in the span of a few hours. "Did you know this was going to happen?" she asked without preamble. I met her gaze steadily. "I knew there was an investigation. An investigation you started by lying to medical professionals about our family. The accusation hung between us, and I realized this was the moment I'd been both dreading and preparing for since I first spoke to Dr. Mitchell. My mother had made her choice, and it wasn't me. I didn't lie, Mom. I told them exactly what Derek has been doing to me for the past 3 years." My mother's face crumpled, not with sympathy for what I'd endured, but with grief for what she was losing. "Derek is a good man, Maya. He's worked so hard to take care of this family, to be a father to you when your real father couldn't be here. How could you destroy that? How could you destroy him?" The words hit me like physical blows. Even faced with official charges and an arrest warrant, my mother was still defending Derek and blaming me for the consequences of his actions. I felt something inside me break, not from sadness but from a kind of liberating rage. He's been abusing me, Mom, physically and emotionally abusing me for years. And you knew it was happening because you saw the bruises, you heard the fights, you watched me become a different person. But you chose to look away because it was easier than admitting you'd brought a predator into our home. My mother stepped backward as if I'd slapped her. Don't you dare call him that. Derek loves you. He loves all of us. This is just some misunderstanding that got blown out of proportion. A misunderstanding. I couldn't keep the incredulity out of my voice. Mom, they arrested him. Police officers came to our house with handcuffs because there's enough evidence to prove he's been hurting me. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is justice. We stared at each other across a chasm that had been growing for years, but was now impossible to bridge. My mother saw a daughter who had betrayed her family. I saw a woman who had failed to protect her child. Neither of us was entirely wrong, but we could no longer exist in the same version of reality. I want you out, my mother said quietly. I want you out of this house today. The words should have hurt more than they did, but I'd been preparing for this possibility since the investigation began. Janet had warned me that families often expelled the victim rather than acknowledge the abuse, especially when the abuser was the primary financial provider. Fine, I said. I'll pack my things. As I pulled suitcases out of my closet and began filling them with clothes and personal items, I could hear my mother on the phone again, this time calling relatives to explain the situation. Her version of events painted Derek as the victim of a vindictive teenager's false accusations, and me as an ungrateful child who had destroyed a loving family out of spite. By noon I was standing on the front porch with 3 suitcases and a backpack, waiting for Janet Brooks to pick me up. She'd arranged for me to stay at Haven House temporarily while we figured out more permanent housing arrangements. As I waited, neighbors began emerging from their houses, drawn by the earlier police activity and now curious about the teenage girl with luggage standing alone on the Wilson family's front lawn. Mrs. Chen from next door approached cautiously. Maya, honey, are you okay? I saw the police cars this morning. I looked at this woman who had heard my cries for help through thin walls for years, but had never called anyone or intervened. Part of me wanted to be angry with her, but mostly I felt tired. I'm okay, I said. I'm getting help now. Mrs. Chen nodded, her expression troubled. I always wondered if everything was all right over there. Sometimes at night I could hear, she trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. I know, I said. But it's going to be different now. When Janet arrived, she helped me load my belongings into her car while Mrs. Chen watched from her driveway. As we pulled away from Maple Street, I looked back at the house where I'd lived for 4 years, and felt nothing resembling nostalgia. That building had never been my home. It had been my prison, and I was finally free. Haven House was a converted Victorian mansion on the outskirts of Riverside, surrounded by tall trees that provided privacy from the street. The director, Rebecca Foster, met us at the front door with a warm smile and gentle manner that immediately put me at ease. She explained the house rules and schedule while giving me a tour of the common areas, the kitchen where residents took turns preparing meals, and the small bedroom I'd be sharing with another teenage girl named Alex. Alex was 16, a junior at a different high school who'd been living at Haven House for 3 months after escaping an abusive home situation similar to mine. She had short purple hair and a collection of band t-shirts that made her look tougher than she actually was. Within an hour of my arrival, she'd helped me unpack and was explaining the informal social dynamics of shelter life. The first few weeks are the hardest, Alex told me as we folded my clothes into the small dresser we shared. You keep expecting someone to come drag you back, or you feel guilty for leaving, or you wonder if you made a mistake. All of that is normal. I nodded, grateful to be talking to someone who understood the complex emotions of leaving an abusive family. How long do people usually stay here? It depends, Alex said. Some girls are here for a few weeks while their cases get sorted out, others stay longer if they're trying to finish high school or save money for their own place. Rebecca doesn't kick you out for hitting some arbitrary time limit, but she does expect you to work toward independence. That evening I attended my first group session with the other residents. There were 6 of us ranging in age from 15 to 17, all with different stories but remarkably similar experiences of family betrayal and systematic abuse. We sat in a circle in the living room while Rebecca facilitated a discussion about coping strategies and goal setting. When it was my turn to introduce myself, I found myself struggling to summarize everything that had led me to this moment. "I'm Maya," I said finally. "My stepfather was arrested this morning for child abuse. My mother kicked me out for reporting him, and I guess I'm starting over." The other girls nodded with understanding that didn't require explanation. We all knew what it meant to have your family choose your abuser over your safety. We all understood the peculiar combination of relief and grief that came with escaping toxicity. Over the next few days, I began to establish a new routine. I continued attending classes at Riverside Central, though the bus route from Haven House was longer and more complicated than my previous commute. I kept working my shifts at the library, grateful for the income and the sense of normalcy that routine employment provided, and I began meeting regularly with Michael Harrison, the prosecutor assigned to Derek's case. Michael was a man in his late 30s, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of intense focus that suggested he took these cases personally. During our first meeting, he explained the charges Derek was facing and what to expect during the legal proceedings. Child abuse in the first degree carries a potential sentence of 2 to 8 years in prison. Michael explained. The endangerment charges add additional time. Given the pattern of abuse documented in your case and the evidence we have, I'm confident we can secure a conviction. He also warned me that Derek's defense attorney would likely try to discredit my testimony by attacking my credibility, my mental health, and my motivations for reporting the abuse. They'll paint you as a troubled teenager with behavioral problems who made false accusations to get attention or revenge. It's a common defense strategy, and it can be emotionally difficult for victims to endure. I thought about Derek's threats and manipulations, his systematic campaign to isolate me and undermine my confidence. I've been dealing with his psychological warfare for 3 years, I said. I think I can handle his lawyer. Michael smiled at that. I believe you can. But remember, you don't have to handle it alone. We have victim advocates who will support you throughout the process, and I'll be there to object to any inappropriate questioning. Derek's arraignment was scheduled for the following Monday. I wasn't required to attend, but I wanted to see him face the charges officially. Janet offered to accompany me, and we sat in the back of the courtroom as Derek was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit and shackles. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the institutional clothing and the formal setting. For 3 years, Derek had loomed large in my life, an omnipresent threat whose moods and whims controlled my daily existence. But sitting in that courtroom, watching him shuffle forward to stand before the judge, I realized he was just a man. A cruel, manipulative man who had hurt children, but ultimately just a human being who was finally being held accountable for his actions. Derek's lawyer, a sharp-dressed woman named Patricia Coleman, entered a plea of not guilty to all charges. She also requested that Derek be released on bail, arguing that he was a longtime member of the community with no flight risk and strong family ties. Michael objected to the bail request, citing the ongoing danger Derek posed to his victims and the possibility that he might attempt to intimidate witnesses. The defendant has demonstrated a pattern of controlling and manipulative behavior toward family members, Michael argued. Releasing him would put vulnerable individuals at risk. The judge ultimately set bail at $50,000, with conditions that Derek have no contact with me or Tyler, and that he surrender his passport. As the hearing concluded and Derek was led back to holding, he turned and scanned the courtroom until his eyes found mine. The look he gave me was pure hatred, concentrated and venomous in a way that made me understand why people talk about feeling someone's stare. Derek's expression promised retribution, consequences for my betrayal that would extend far beyond whatever sentence the court might impose. But instead of fear, I felt something unexpected: pity. Derek Wilson, the man who had terrorized me for years, was standing in shackles while I sat free in the gallery. His carefully constructed facade of respectability had crumbled, revealing the petty bully underneath. His threats were empty now because he no longer had access to me, and his manipulations were useless because I'd learned to see through them. After the hearing, Michael walked Janet and me to the parking garage. "How are you feeling about all of this?" he asked. I considered the question seriously. Scared, I admitted, but also hopeful. For the first time in years, I feel like someone with authority is taking this seriously and working to stop it. "The legal process can be slow and frustrating," Michael warned. "Derek's lawyer will file motions, request delays, and try every tactic she can think of to avoid trial, but we have a strong case, and I'm committed to seeing it through." That afternoon, I returned to Haven House to find a social worker I didn't recognize waiting to speak with me. She introduced herself as Patricia Wells from Child Protective Services and explained that she needed to discuss Tyler's living situation. "Your stepfather made bail this afternoon," Patricia said. "He's been released with restrictions, but he's back in the family home. Given that Tyler is Derek's biological son, and your mother is his primary caregiver, there are complex custody issues we need to navigate." My heart sank. I'd been so focused on my own escape and Derek's prosecution that I hadn't fully considered what would happen to Tyler. He was only 8 years old, too young to understand the adult dynamics at play, but old enough to be affected by Derek's behavior. "Is Tyler safe?" I asked. "We're monitoring the situation closely," Patricia said. "Derek is required to attend anger management counseling and parenting classes as conditions of his bail. We'll also be conducting regular home visits to ensure Tyler's well-being." It wasn't enough. I knew Derek's capacity for manipulation, his ability to present a perfect facade when being observed while conducting his real business in private. But I also understood that removing Tyler from his biological father's custody required a much higher legal standard than protecting me, especially since I was nearly 18 and could speak for myself. "What about when Derek's case goes to trial?" I asked. "Tyler might be called as a witness." Patricia nodded gravely. "That's a possibility we're preparing for. Tyler has been assigned his own advocate to represent his interests separately from both his parents. We want to minimize his involvement in the proceedings, but if his testimony is necessary to protect him or secure justice for you, we'll take appropriate steps." That night, I lay awake in my narrow shelter bed thinking about Tyler sleeping in the house with Derek. I wondered if Derek was being careful now, knowing he was being watched, or if his anger over the arrest was making him more volatile. I thought about my mother, caught between loyalty to her husband and concern for her son, probably convinced that Derek's behavior would improve now that the misunderstanding had been cleared up. I also thought about the other residents of Haven House, young women who had made the difficult choice to prioritize their safety over family unity. We were all learning to build new lives from the wreckage of old ones, to create chosen families from the networks of support that had emerged to help us. Rebecca knocked on my door around midnight, checking to make sure I was adjusting well to shelter life. "It's normal to have trouble sleeping the first few weeks," she said softly. "Big life changes are exhausting even when they're positive changes. I keep thinking about my little brother," I told her. "I feel guilty for leaving him with Derek." Rebecca sat on the edge of my bed, her expression understanding. "You can't save someone who doesn't know they need saving, Maya, and you can't protect others if you don't protect yourself first. By getting out and speaking up, you've created the possibility that Tyler will be safer too." She was right, but the knowledge didn't make the guilt easier to bear. I'd spent 3 years shielding Tyler from Derek's worst impulses, redirecting attention and anger away from him whenever possible. Now he was navigating that household without my protection, and I had to trust that the legal system would monitor his safety adequately. The next few weeks settled into a strange new rhythm. I attended classes, worked at the library, participated in group therapy sessions at Haven House, and met regularly with Michael to prepare for Derek's trial. My mother stopped calling after the first few days, apparently convinced that I would eventually come to my senses and apologize for destroying the family. Derek's defense strategy became clear through the various pre-trial motions his lawyer filed. They were arguing that I was a troubled teenager with a history of behavioral problems who had fabricated the abuse allegations for attention and revenge. They planned to present evidence of my declining grades, my disciplinary issues at school, and what they
characterized as my resentment toward Derek's authority in the household. Michael wasn't concerned by these tactics. It's exactly what we expected, he told me during one of our preparation sessions. The defense has to attack your credibility because they can't dispute the physical evidence. But we have medical documentation, witness statements, and your contemporaneous records of abuse. A jury will see through their attempts at character assassination. As Derek's trial date approached, I began to feel something I hadn't experienced in years. Not just hope for justice, but confidence in my own voice and testimony. The frightened, isolated girl who had whispered karma's coming in her bathroom mirror was gone. In her place was a young woman who understood her worth, knew her truth, and was prepared to speak it regardless of the consequences. Derek Wilson had tried to break me, to silence me, to convince me that I was worthless and powerless. But standing in that courtroom, surrounded by people who believed in my truth and fought for my safety, I realized he had failed completely. The real karma wasn't Derek's arrest or upcoming trial. It was my transformation from victim to survivor to advocate. It was the strength I'd discovered in my own voice and the community I'd found among other survivors. It was the knowledge that I would never again allow someone to make me feel small or worthless or silenced. Derek had taught me what I wouldn't accept. Now I was ready to show the world what I would fight for. The courtroom smelled like old wood and nervous sweat. I sat in the witness waiting area, my hands folded in my lap, wearing the navy blue dress Rebecca had helped me pick out from the donation closet at Haven House. It was simple, professional, the kind of outfit that said I was serious and credible without trying too hard. My hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and I wore minimal makeup, wanting the jury to see me as I was rather than some manufactured version of myself. Michael Harrison appeared in the doorway, his expression calm but focused. "Maya, we're ready for you." I stood up, my legs feeling steadier than I'd expected. For weeks, I'd been preparing for this moment, practicing my testimony and learning how to handle cross-examination. But all the preparation in the world couldn't eliminate the reality that I was about to face Derek Wilson in open court and tell the truth about what he'd done to me. The courtroom was packed. I recognized some faces from my high school, teachers and administrators who had been subpoenaed to testify about my behavior and academic performance. I saw Mrs. Chen from next door, looking uncomfortable but determined. Dr. Mitchell sat in the gallery, offering me an encouraging nod when our eyes met, and in the back corner, partially hidden behind a pillar, I spotted Tyler sitting next to a woman I didn't recognize, probably his court-appointed advocate. Derek sat at the defense table wearing a well-tailored gray suit, his posture straight and confident. His lawyer, Patricia Coleman, had clearly coached him on courtroom presentation. He looked like a respectable businessman facing trumped-up charges, rather than an abuser being held accountable for years of systematic cruelty. When I walked past his table toward the witness stand, he didn't look at me, but I could feel the tension radiating from his rigid posture. Judge Patricia Coleman, a stern woman in her 50s with silver hair and sharp eyes, swore me in with the familiar words about telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. I placed my hand on the Bible and promised to do exactly that, something I'd been doing consistently for months, despite every attempt to silence me. Michael approached the witness stand with a gentle expression. "Maya, would you please state your full name for the record?" "Maya Elizabeth Thompson." "And how old are you, Maya?" "I'm 17. I'll be 18 next month." "How long did you live in the same household as the defendant Derek Wilson?" I looked directly at Derek as I answered. 4 years, from the time I was 13 until I moved out in February. Michael guided me through my testimony methodically, starting with how Derek had entered our family and gradually building toward the patterns of abuse. I described the first incident with the garbage can, the systematic psychological manipulation, the physical violence that escalated over time. I spoke about Derek's threats regarding my college applications and his campaign to isolate me from potential sources of help. Maya, did you ever report these incidents to anyone before speaking with Dr. Mitchell? I tried to tell my mother several times, especially in the beginning, but Derek was very good at making me seem like I was overreacting or lying. He'd wait until she wasn't around to hurt me, then act concerned and loving when she was present. Can you describe Derek's behavior toward your younger brother Tyler? I hesitated, glancing toward the back of the courtroom where Tyler sat with his advocate. Derek was more careful with Tyler because Tyler is his biological son, but he was still controlling and intimidating. Tyler learned to walk on eggshells around Derek's moods, just like I did. Michael had me walk through the documentation I'd created, explaining how I'd started keeping records and why I'd felt the need to preserve evidence. He introduced my notebook, photographs of injuries, and even some of the audio recordings I'd made of Derek's verbal abuse. Why did you start documenting these incidents, Maya? Because Derek was so good at making me doubt my own memory. He'd twist situations around, make me feel like I was crazy or oversensitive. Writing things down helped me hold on to reality when he was trying to gaslight me. When Michael played one of the audio recordings for the jury, Derek's voice filled the courtroom with venom and threats that sounded even worse in the formal setting than they had in our kitchen. If you keep acting like a spoiled brat, I'll make sure you regret it. Your mother won't always be around to protect you, and when she's not, you'll learn what real consequences look like. I watched the jury's faces as they listened to Derek's recorded voice. Several of them looked disturbed, and one older woman actually flinched when Derek's tone became particularly menacing. The recordings made it impossible for his defense team to argue that I was making up quotes or exaggerating his behavior. Maya, why did you finally decide to report the abuse to medical professionals? Because I realized it wasn't going to stop on its own. Derek was escalating, becoming more violent and threatening. I knew that if I didn't speak up, he might seriously injure me or turn his attention to Tyler in more dangerous ways. Michael's direct examination took most of the morning. He was thorough but sensitive, allowing me to tell my story in my own words while ensuring that every crucial piece of evidence was presented to the jury. When he finished, I felt drained but relieved. The hardest part was supposed to be over, but then Patricia Coleman stood up for cross-examination, and I understood that Derek wasn't finished trying to destroy me. Coleman was a skilled attorney who knew exactly how to attack a victim's credibility without appearing to bully a teenager. She started with questions about my academic performance, highlighting the decline in my grades over the past 2 years. Maya, your transcript shows that your GPA dropped from 3.8 to 2.3 between your sophomore and senior years. Would you agree that this indicates some kind of behavioral or emotional instability? I would say it indicates that I was living in an abusive household and struggling to concentrate on schoolwork while dealing with trauma. But isn't it possible that your academic struggles led to increased discipline at home, which you then characterized as abuse because you resented the consequences of your own poor choices? Michael objected before I could answer, and Judge Coleman sustained the objection, but the defense attorney had accomplished her goal of planting doubt about my motivations and credibility. Coleman spent considerable time questioning me about my relationship with my mother, suggesting that I resented Derek's presence in our family and had fabricated the abuse allegations to drive him away. Maya, you've testified that your mother didn't believe your initial reports of abuse. Is it possible that she didn't believe you because the incidents you described didn't actually happen the way you claim?
No, my mother didn't believe me because it was easier for her to think I was lying than to admit she'd married someone who was hurting her daughter. That's quite an accusation against your own mother. Do you often blame others for your problems instead of taking responsibility for your own actions? The question was designed to make me angry, to provoke an emotional outburst that would make me seem unstable or vindictive. I took a deep breath and answered calmly, I take responsibility for my decision to finally report the abuse. I take responsibility for documenting what was happening and seeking help from adults who were trained to handle these situations. What I don't take responsibility for is Derek's choice to hurt me repeatedly over several years. Coleman tried several different approaches to undermine my testimony. She questioned the timing of my medical report, suggesting I'd waited until I had a minor injury to fabricate a larger pattern of abuse. She challenged my documentation methods, implying that I'd created false evidence to support a revenge fantasy. She even attempted to introduce evidence about my father's death, suggesting that my grief had made me hostile toward any male authority figure. But every attack felt weaker than Derek's psychological warfare had been. Coleman was operating within legal and ethical boundaries, constrained by rules of evidence and judicial oversight. Derek had operated in the shadows, using my love for my family and my fear of consequences to keep me silent. Facing his lawyer in open court, surrounded by people whose job it was to seek truth, felt almost easy by comparison. The most difficult moment came when Coleman asked about my current living situation at Haven House. Maya, you're currently residing in a shelter for victims of domestic violence, correct? Yes, and this shelter provides you with free housing, meals, and counseling services. Yes, is it possible that you have a financial incentive to maintain your allegations against Derek, since your continued residency in this facility depends on your status as a victim? Michael objected furiously, but the damage was done. Coleman was suggesting that I was lying to maintain access to shelter services, turning my need for safety into evidence against my credibility. I don't have a financial incentive to lie, I said firmly. I have a moral obligation to tell the truth about what Derek did to me, and to make sure he doesn't hurt anyone else. When Coleman finally finished her cross-examination, I felt like I'd been through a battle, but I also felt victorious. Every question she'd asked, every attack on my character and motivations, had given me another opportunity to speak my truth. Derek's lawyer was skilled, but she couldn't change the fundamental facts of what had happened or explain away the evidence I'd gathered. The prosecution's case continued with testimony from Dr. Mitchell, who explained the medical documentation of my injuries and described my demeanor during our initial consultation. Janet Brooks testified about the investigation process and the corroborating evidence she'd gathered from neighbors and school personnel. Mrs. Chen took the stand to describe what she'd heard through the walls of our adjoining houses over the years. The most compelling witness was probably Tyler's therapist, Dr. Sarah Martinez, who had been working with him since Derek's arrest. She testified about Tyler's descriptions of the household atmosphere and his own fear of Derek's anger. Tyler has described walking on eggshells around his father, Dr. Martinez explained. He's talked about hiding in his room when Derek was upset and feeling responsible for preventing conflicts between family members. These are classic patterns we see in children who are living with domestic violence. The defense case was brief and predictable. Coleman called character witnesses who testified about Derek's reputation in the community and his contributions to Tyler's Little League team. Derek's brother took the stand to describe him as a devoted family man who was being railroaded by a troubled teenager. Derek himself chose not to testify, probably on the advice of his lawyer, who understood that cross-examination would be devastating given the recorded evidence of his threats and abuse. The closing arguments were powerful presentations of two completely different narratives. Coleman portrayed me as a manipulative teenager who had fabricated abuse allegations to punish Derek for trying to provide appropriate parental guidance. She characterized the physical evidence as minor injuries blown out of proportion and the recorded threats as normal parental discipline taken out of context. Michael's closing was devastating in its simplicity. He played portions of the audio recordings again, reminding the jury that Derek's own voice provided the strongest evidence of his abusive behavior. He walked through the medical documentation, the witness statements, and the contemporaneous records I'd created, building an overwhelming case that abuse had occurred systematically over several years. The defense wants you to believe that Maya Thompson is a master manipulator who spent years creating false evidence to frame her stepfather, Michael said. But I ask you to consider a simpler explanation. Maya is a brave young woman who documented the truth about what was happening in her home and finally found the courage to speak up when the abuse escalated to dangerous levels. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned to the courtroom, their expressions were solemn and determined. The foreman stood and delivered the verdict I'd been waiting to hear for months. On the charge of child abuse in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of child endangerment, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of making terroristic threats, we find the defendant guilty. Derek's face went completely white as the words were read. For the first time since his arrest, his carefully controlled facade cracked, revealing the shock and rage underneath. His lawyer put a restraining hand on his arm as he started to rise from his chair, probably wanting to object or argue or somehow reverse what had just happened. I felt a wave of relief so intense it was almost physical. For 4 years, Derek had controlled my life through fear and manipulation. He'd convinced me that no one would believe me, that he was untouchable, that speaking up would only make things worse. But 12 strangers had listened to the evidence and concluded that he was guilty of everything I'd accused him of. Judge Coleman scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later, reminding Derek that he remained in custody and that his bail was revoked pending the sentencing hearing. As the bailiffs led him away in shackles, Derek turned and looked at me one final time, but instead of the hatred and threats I'd expected, I saw something that looked almost like defeat. Derek Wilson, the man who had terrorized me for years, finally understood that his power over me was gone forever. The sentencing hearing was anticlimactic compared to the trial. Derek's lawyer argued for leniency, emphasizing his lack of a prior criminal record and his role as Tyler's father. She presented letters from community members asking for mercy and highlighting Derek's contributions to local charities and youth sports. Michael argued for the maximum sentence, pointing out that Derek had shown no remorse for his actions and continued to maintain his innocence despite overwhelming evidence. He also noted that Derek had escalated his abuse over time, suggesting that he would likely reoffend if given the opportunity. I was given the opportunity to make a victim impact statement, and I'd spent weeks preparing what I wanted to say. I stood at the podium facing Derek directly, no longer afraid of his anger or intimidation. Derek Wilson spent 4 years trying to convince me that I was worthless, that no one would believe me, and that I deserved everything he did to me. I said, he was wrong about all of those things. I am not worthless. People did believe me, and I never deserved to be abused. I talked about the impact his abuse had on my education, my relationships, and my mental health. I described the fear I'd lived with, and the way his threats had shaped every decision I made for years. But I also want to talk about what Derek didn't destroy. I continued. He didn't destroy my ability to recognize right from wrong. He didn't destroy my capacity to seek help when I needed it. And he didn't destroy my voice. I concluded by addressing Derek directly. You tried to silence me for years, but your trial gave me the biggest platform I've ever had to speak the truth. So thank you for that. Thank you for teaching me exactly what I would never accept from anyone else, and thank you for showing me how strong I actually am. Judge Coleman sentenced Derek to 6 years in state prison, the near maximum penalty given his lack of prior convictions. She also imposed a permanent restraining order preventing him from contacting me and ordered him to complete anger management and parenting classes before any consideration of supervised visitation with Tyler. As Derek was led away to begin his prison sentence, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my father died: complete safety. For the first time in 4 years, I could go to sleep without wondering when Derek's next attack would come. I could make plans for my future without worrying about his sabotage. I could speak freely without fear of retaliation. The aftermath of Derek's conviction brought unexpected changes to my family dynamics. My mother, faced with the reality of Derek's guilt and imprisonment, began attending therapy to understand how she'd failed to protect me. It would be months before we could have a real conversation, and years before we could rebuild any kind of relationship, but her willingness to acknowledge what had happened was a first step. Tyler began spending weekends with me at Haven House, slowly learning that he could express his feelings without fear of explosive consequences. His own therapy continued, helping him process the trauma of growing up in a household dominated by Derek's anger and control. I graduated from high school that spring, walking across the stage to receive my diploma while Rebecca and the other residents of Haven House cheered from the audience. My grades had improved dramatically during my final semester, freed from the constant stress of living with Derek's threats and violence. Ohio State University offered me a full scholarship for the fall, recognizing both my academic potential and my advocacy work with other survivors of domestic violence. I'd started speaking at local high schools about recognizing abuse and seeking help, sharing my story with teenagers who might be facing similar situations. The speaking engagements led to an internship with a nonprofit organization that provided legal advocacy for victims of family violence. Working with attorneys like Michael Harrison, I learned how to help other survivors navigate the complex legal system and find their own voices in courtroom settings. On the 1-year anniversary of Derek's arrest, I returned to Maple Street for the first time since leaving with my suitcases. The house looked smaller than I remembered, less imposing. Mrs. Chen waved from her garden, and we had a brief conversation about how much quieter the neighborhood had become. "I'm proud of you for speaking up," she told me. "I should have done something sooner, but I didn't know how to help." "You helped by testifying at the trial," I reminded her. "That mattered more than you know." As I stood on the sidewalk looking at the house where I'd lived in fear for so long, I thought about the girl who used to whisper threats about karma in her bathroom mirror. She'd been right about karma coming, but she'd been wrong about needing backup. The truth had been powerful enough on its own. Derek Wilson had taught me what abuse looked like, but he'd also inadvertently taught me what strength looked like. He'd shown me the importance of documentation, the power of speaking up, and the value of finding people who would believe and support me. Most importantly, he'd taught me that silence isn't protection, silence is just another form of imprisonment, and I would never be silent again. As I walked back to my car, I smiled, thinking about the speech I was giving the next week at a conference for social workers and prosecutors. The title was From Victim to Advocate: How Speaking Truth Changes Everything. It was the story Derek never wanted me to tell, delivered to an audience of people whose job it was to help other survivors find their voices. Karma hadn't just come for Derek Wilson, karma had transformed me into someone who could prevent other children from enduring what I'd survived. And that transformation would last long after Derek finished serving his sentence. The girl who once whispered about karma in secret had become a woman who spoke about justice in public. Derek had lost everything trying to silence me, and I had gained everything by refusing to stay quiet. In the end, that was the only justice that really mattered. 5 years later, I stood in the auditorium at the state capitol building in Columbus, looking out at an audience of legislators, law enforcement officials, and victim advocates. The microphone felt familiar in my hand now, no longer the terrifying instrument it had once been. I was here to testify in favor of House Bill 247, legislation that would strengthen mandatory reporting requirements and improve protections for minors who report family abuse. My name is Maya Thompson, and I'm here today because a system worked when it almost didn't. I began, my voice carrying clearly through the packed room. 5 years ago, I was a 17-year-old girl trapped in an abusive household, convinced that no one would believe me and that speaking up would only make things worse. Today, I'm a college graduate working as a victim advocate, and I've helped over 200 survivors navigate the legal system and reclaim their voices. The audience was attentive, taking notes and nodding as I described the gaps in the system that had nearly prevented me from getting help. I talked about the importance of training medical professionals to recognize signs of abuse, the need for specialized courts to handle family violence cases, and the crucial role of transitional housing for teenagers aging out of dangerous situations. When Dr. Amanda Mitchell examined my injuries and made the decision to report suspected abuse, she saved my life, I continued, but she also told me later that she almost didn't make that call. She was concerned about disrupting what appeared to be a stable middle-class family based on the word of one teenager. That hesitation is understandable, but it's also dangerous. I shared statistics about underreporting of family abuse, the average length of time victims stay silent before seeking help, and the correlation between early intervention and successful outcomes. But I also shared personal stories from the survivors I'd worked with, painting pictures of real people whose lives had been changed by having someone believe them and take action. The young woman who called our hotline last month had been recording her stepmother's emotional abuse for 3 years, just like I had recorded Derek's threats. But unlike me, she didn't know that she could take those recordings to a mandated reporter and have them taken seriously. She'd been told by a school counselor that family discipline wasn't the same as abuse, and she'd been discouraged from making waves that might disrupt her household. The legislators asked thoughtful questions about implementation costs and training requirements. I answered with the confidence that came from years of working within the system, understanding both its strengths and its limitations. When one representative asked about false reporting concerns, I addressed the question directly. False reports of child abuse are statistically rare, occurring in less than 4% of cases, according to the Department of Health and Human Services. But even if we accept inflated estimates, we're talking about a small number of false reports compared to the thousands of children who suffer in silence because they don't know how to seek help or they've been discouraged from speaking up. After the hearing, I was approached by Senator Maria Rodriguez, who had co-sponsored the bill. Maya, your testimony was incredibly powerful. I think you moved some minds today, particularly among the legislators who were concerned about government overreach into family matters. Senator Rodriguez and I discussed the political challenges of passing child protection legislation in a conservative state. Many lawmakers were genuinely concerned about children's welfare, but also worried about creating systems that could be used to harass or punish good parents who were simply trying to maintain discipline in their households. That's exactly why survivor voices are so important in this process, I explained. When lawmakers hear from real people who've been through the system, it helps them understand the difference between appropriate intervention and government interference. That evening, I returned to my apartment near the Ohio State campus, where I was finishing my master's degree in social work. The space was small, but entirely mine, decorated with photos from my advocacy work and artwork created by some of the teenagers I'd worked with over the years. My cat, Justice, greeted me at the door with the kind of unconditional affection that still felt miraculous after years of conditional love in Derek's household. I poured myself a glass of wine and settled onto my couch to review emails from the nonprofit where I worked full-time. There were several new intake requests from teenagers seeking help with family abuse situations. a scheduling confirmation for a training session I was conducting with local police officers, and an invitation to speak at a conference in Denver about trauma-informed advocacy approaches. One email stood out from the others. The subject line read, "Thank you for changing my life," and the sender was someone named Ashley Martinez. I opened it with the mixture of curiosity and trepidation that always accompanied messages from strangers who had heard my story. "Dear Maya, you probably don't remember me, but I attended your presentation at Riverside High School 3 years ago when I was a sophomore. You talked about recognizing the signs of emotional abuse and the importance of documenting incidents for your own clarity and safety. At the time, I thought you were talking to other people, not to me." Ashley went on to describe how my presentation had helped her recognize that her father's behavior toward her wasn't normal parental discipline, but systematic psychological abuse. She'd started keeping records similar to mine, eventually working up the courage to speak with a school counselor who connected her with family services. "My father was never arrested like your stepfather was, but
The investigation led to family therapy that actually helped. My parents are divorced now, and I live with my mom, but my dad is getting treatment for his anger issues, and we're slowly rebuilding our relationship. None of that would have happened if you hadn't given me the words to describe what was happening to me." Ashley concluded by telling me she was starting college in the fall with plans to study psychology and work with trauma survivors. "You showed me that surviving something terrible doesn't have to define your whole life. It can become the foundation for helping other people survive too." I read the email twice, feeling the familiar mixture of sadness for Ashley's experience and pride in her resilience. These messages came regularly now from young people whose lives had been touched by my advocacy work. Each one reminded me why I'd chosen this path and validated the decision to transform my trauma into purpose. My phone buzzed with a text from Tyler, now 13 and thriving in middle school. "Maya, got an A on my history project about civil rights advocates. Wrote about you and people who fought for justice. Can you proofread it before I turn it in?" Tyler and I had developed a close relationship over the years since Derek's conviction. He spent several weekends a month at my apartment, and I attended his school events and sports games whenever possible. The trauma of Derek's abuse had affected him too, but therapy and our rebuilt family relationships had helped him process those experiences in healthy ways. My mother and I had also found our way back to each other, though the process had been slow and sometimes painful. She'd spent 2 years in individual therapy working through her own trauma history and the guilt she felt about failing to protect me from Derek. We met for lunch once a month now, and while our relationship would never be exactly what it had been before Derek entered our lives, it was honest in a way it had never been before. "I used to think that keeping the peace was the same as keeping the family safe," she'd told me during one of our early reconciliation conversations. "I thought if I could just manage everyone's emotions and avoid conflicts, we could all be happy. But I realize now that I was just enabling Derek's abuse and teaching you that your safety didn't matter as much as his comfort." The next morning I drove to the Hamilton County Courthouse for a hearing in one of my current cases. 16-year-old Jessica Chen, no relation to my former neighbor, was seeking emancipation from parents who had subjected her to years of educational and emotional abuse. Jessica's parents were high-achieving immigrants who had pushed her academically to the point of psychological breakdown, threatening to disown her if she didn't maintain perfect grades and pursue the career path they'd chosen for her. Jessica's case was complicated because her parents genuinely believed they were acting in her best interests. Unlike Derek's deliberate cruelty, the Chen's abuse came from cultural expectations and their own trauma histories as refugees who had sacrificed everything for their children's opportunities. But the impact on Jessica was just as devastating, and she deserved protection regardless of her parents' motivations. I sat with Jessica in the courthouse hallway, reviewing her testimony and reminding her of the breathing techniques we'd practiced. "Remember, you're not here to destroy your parents or prove they're evil people," I told her. "You're here to establish that you need space to heal and grow without the constant pressure that's been damaging your mental health." Jessica nodded, clutching the folder containing her documentation. She'd learned from my example and had been keeping detailed records of the threats, ultimatums, and emotional manipulation she'd endured. Her evidence was thorough and compelling, painting a picture of parents who loved her but had created an environment where that love felt conditional and punitive. The hearing went well, with Jessica presenting her case calmly and clearly. Her parents' attorney argued that emancipation was an extreme response to normal parental expectations, but the judge was impressed by Jessica's maturity and the evidence she'd presented. The emancipation was granted with provisions for family counseling and gradual reconciliation efforts. After the hearing, Jessica hugged me tightly in the courthouse lobby. "I couldn't have done this without you showing me that it was possible," she said. "When I first heard your story, I thought our situations were completely different. But you helped me understand that abuse doesn't have to involve hitting or screaming to be real and harmful." These victories accumulated over the years, each one representing a young person who had found their voice and reclaimed their power. But they also represented systemic changes in how institutions responded to reports of family abuse. The training programs I conducted with police departments, social workers, and medical professionals were creating networks of people who knew how to recognize and respond to abuse more effectively. That afternoon, I returned to my office at the Ohio Coalition Against Family Violence, where I served as the director of youth advocacy. My assistant informed me that I had a call from a producer at a national news program who wanted to interview me about a high-profile case involving a celebrity accused of abusing their teenage children. "Maya Thompson, this is Jennifer Walsh from News Nation Tonight. We're covering the Harrison family abuse allegations, and we'd like to get your perspective on how these cases typically unfold and what the public should understand about family abuse dynamics." I agreed to the interview, though I was careful to focus on general patterns rather than speculation about any specific case. The media attention had become a regular part of my advocacy work, an opportunity to educate the public about issues that were often misunderstood or sensationalized. During the interview, which aired that evening, I talked about the myths that prevented people from recognizing abuse in seemingly successful families. Abuse isn't limited to certain economic classes or educational backgrounds, I explained. Abusers can be charming and successful in public while being controlling and cruel at home. That's exactly what makes it so difficult for victims to be believed when they do speak up. The interviewer asked about my own experience, and I shared the now familiar story of Derek's abuse and prosecution. But I also emphasized the broader implications of individual cases like mine. "My story isn't unique in its basic elements," I said. "What makes it unusual is that the system worked for me. I had a doctor who recognized the signs and took action. I had a social worker who believed me and built a strong case. I had a prosecutor who fought for justice and a jury who saw through the defense's attempts to discredit me. Too many survivors don't have those advantages." After the interview, I walked across campus to meet my graduate advisor, Dr. Susan Clark, who had become both a mentor and a friend over the past 3 years. We met monthly to discuss my research project, which focused on improving outcomes for teenagers who reported family abuse. "Maya, I've been reviewing your latest data analysis, and the results are really compelling," Dr. Clark said as we settled into her office with coffee. "The correlation between early therapeutic intervention and successful family reunification is even stronger than we hypothesized." My research had involved following up with hundreds of abuse survivors over several years, tracking their outcomes based on different intervention approaches. The data showed that families who received immediate counseling and support services were much more likely to achieve healthy relationships than those who went through purely punitive legal processes. "It supports what I've seen in my advocacy work," I replied. "Punishment alone doesn't heal the underlying issues that create abusive dynamics. Derek needed to face consequences for what he did, but Tyler and my mother also needed support to understand how the abuse had affected them." Dr. Clark and I discussed my plans after graduation. I'd been accepted to a PhD program with a focus on family systems and trauma recovery, but I'd also received an offer to direct a new statewide initiative for youth victim services. Both opportunities excited me, though they would take me in different directions professionally. Have you thought about the possibility of doing both? Dr. Clark suggested. The PhD program has a practitioner track that would allow you to continue your direct service work while conducting research. You could literally write the book on best practices for teen abuse advocacy. The idea was appealing. Writing had become an important part of my advocacy work, and I'd published several articles in social work journals about innovative approaches to serving young survivors. A doctoral degree would give me the credibility to influence policy at the highest levels while continuing to work directly with the teenagers who needed support. That evening, I attended a support group meeting at Haven House, where I volunteered as a facilitator twice a month. The current residents included girls dealing with situations similar to mine, as well as young women escaping romantic partner abuse, family trafficking, and other forms of exploitation. Tonight's discussion focused on rebuilding relationships after trauma, a topic that resonated with most of the participants. 17-year-old Amanda shared her struggle with trusting adults after years of being failed by the people who were supposed to protect her. 19-year-old Destiny talked about the challenges of dating when you'd learn to associate love with control and violence. How do you know when someone actually cares about you versus when they're just trying to manipulate you? Amanda asked the group. I feel like I can't tell the difference anymore. I listened as the other participants shared their own experiences and insights. These conversations reminded me why I'd chosen to dedicate my career to this work. Every person in the room had survived something that should have destroyed them, and they were all working to build better lives despite the trauma they'd endured. One thing I've learned, I said when it was my turn to share, is that healthy relationships feel different from abusive ones, even when you're not sure exactly what the difference is. People who genuinely care about you want you to be happy and successful. They don't try to control your decisions or make you feel bad about yourself. After the meeting, Rebecca Foster, who was now the executive director of Haven House, walked me to my car. We'd maintained a close relationship over the years since I'd lived there, and she'd become something like a second mother to me. Maya, I've been thinking about succession planning for the organization, Rebecca said as we reached the parking lot. I'm hoping to retire in a few years, and the board is going to need someone with strong clinical skills and lived experience to take over. Have you ever thought about running a residential program? The suggestion surprised me, though it shouldn't have. I'd been involved with Haven House as a volunteer and board member for years, and I understood the organization's operations better than most staff members. Running a shelter would be a natural extension of my advocacy work, allowing me to shape programs and policies while maintaining direct contact with survivors. I'd never considered it seriously, I admitted, but I love what Haven House represents and the work you've built here. It would be an honor to carry that forward. Rebecca smiled. Think about it. We're not in any hurry, but I wanted you to know that you'd have the board's full support if you were interested. Driving home that night, I reflected on the unexpected trajectory my life had taken. 5 years ago, I'd been a frightened teenager documenting abuse and wondering if anyone would ever believe me. Now I was being invited to lead one of the state's most respected programs for violence survivors, potentially pursuing a doctoral degree that would make me a national expert on youth advocacy. Derek Wilson had intended to destroy my future, to keep me dependent and powerless. Instead, his abuse had become the foundation for a career dedicated to empowering other young people and creating systemic changes that would prevent future victims from suffering in silence. The next week brought news that Derek's parole application had been denied. He'd served 3 years of his 6-year sentence and was arguing for early release based on his participation in anger management programs and his clean disciplinary record in prison. But the parole board had reviewed my impact statement and the ongoing protection order, determining that he still posed a risk to public safety. I felt relief at the news, though I'd been preparing for the possibility of his release. Derek would eventually be freed, and I'd made peace with that reality. By the time he completed his sentence, I'd be Dr. Maya Thompson with a career, a home, and a network of support that he could never touch. He would be a middle-aged ex-convict with limited prospects and a permanent record of his crimes.
Tyler called that evening to tell me about his latest school play, in which he was playing a supporting role as a character who stood up to bullies. The drama teacher says I'm really good at playing characters who fight for justice, he said proudly. I told her I learned from the best. My relationship with Tyler had become one of the most rewarding aspects of my post-Derek life. He'd grown into a thoughtful, empathetic teenager who understood the difference between strength and aggression. His experience with Derek's abuse had given him unusual insight into power dynamics and manipulation tactics, making him naturally protective of other kids who might be struggling. Tyler, I'm so proud of the person you're becoming, I told him. You've taken everything we went through and used it to become more compassionate instead of harder. That's not easy to do. You showed me how, he replied simply. You could have let Derek make you mean and angry, but instead you decided to help people. I want to do that too. 3 months later, I accepted the offer to direct the statewide youth advocacy initiative while beginning the PhD program part-time. The new position would allow me to design and implement programs across Ohio, training professionals and creating resources for teenagers in situations similar to what I'd experienced. My first major project was developing a curriculum for high school students about recognizing and responding to abuse in their own families or peer relationships. The program would include information about documentation techniques, mandatory reporting laws, and resources for getting help safely. We're calling it Finding Your Voice, I explained to the program officers who would be funding the initiative. The goal is to give teenagers the knowledge and tools they need to advocate for themselves and their peers, while also training adults in schools and community organizations to respond appropriately when young people reach out for help. The program launched in 20 pilot schools across Ohio, with plans to expand statewide based on the initial results. I traveled to different districts conducting training sessions and speaking with students about the importance of breaking silence around family abuse. At one high school in Akron, a junior named Marcus approached me after my presentation. He was a tall, athletic kid who played on the varsity basketball team, not someone most people would have suspected of dealing with abuse at home. Miss Thompson, can I talk to you privately? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We found an empty classroom where Marcus told me about his father's escalating violence and his own fear of speaking up because his basketball scholarship depended on maintaining a stable family image. His situation was heartbreakingly familiar, but I was able to connect him with resources and help him develop a safety plan. 6 months later, Marcus sent me a text with a photo of himself signing his letter of intent to attend college on a full athletic scholarship. Couldn't have done this without your help, the message read. My dad's in treatment now, and things are way better at home. Thank you for showing me that asking for help isn't giving up. These individual success stories accumulated into evidence that my programs were making a real difference. The data showed significant increases in reporting rates in schools where I'd conducted training, as well as improved outcomes for teenagers who disclosed abuse to school personnel. As Derek's release date approached, I found myself surprisingly calm about the prospect of him returning to society. I'd built a life that was completely independent of his presence or absence, surrounded by people who supported and believed in me. Derek would be released as a convicted felon, with limited opportunities and a reputation as a child abuser. I would continue my work as a respected advocate and researcher, using my experience to prevent other children from suffering as I had. The night before Derek's scheduled release, I sat in my apartment writing in the journal I'd kept since college. The entry began with a reflection on how much had changed since the scared teenager who first whispered about karma in her bathroom mirror. Derek Wilson taught me what I was capable of surviving, but more importantly, he taught me what I was capable of becoming. His cruelty became the foundation for my compassion, his manipulation became my understanding of how power can be abused. His silence about his crimes became my voice speaking truth about abuse. I wrote about the hundreds of teenagers I'd worked with over the years, each one representing a victory over the mindset that had nearly destroyed me. Derek had wanted me to believe that I was powerless, worthless, and voiceless. Instead, I'd become someone whose voice reached state legislators, national media outlets, and young people across the country who needed to hear that they mattered. The journal entry concluded with a note about my plans for the future. The PhD program was progressing well, and my research was contributing to national conversations about improving child protection systems. The statewide advocacy initiative was expanding to other states, creating a network of programs designed to identify and support young abuse survivors. Derek will be released tomorrow, but his power over my life ended the day I found the courage to tell Dr. Mitchell the truth about what was happening at home. Everything since then has been me choosing to transform trauma into purpose, pain into power, silence into advocacy. Derek Wilson had spent 4 years trying to destroy Maya Thompson. Instead, he'd created Dr. Maya Thompson, a woman whose work would protect thousands of children from experiencing what she'd survived. That was the real karma, the justice that mattered most. The scared girl who once whispered threats in mirrors had become a woman whose voice echoed in legislative chambers, university lecture halls, and the hearts of young people who finally believed they deserved better. Derek's attempt to silence me had failed so completely that my voice had become unstoppable. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.